quick discussion on the fetal development of the heart. First of all, starting up, we need to understand that the heart actually starts off as just a tube, okay? And this tube essentially is going to form into an S shape, okay? So it kind of, you imagine the tube was once like this. It ends up kind of folding so that if this is the front and this is the back, it's going to fold so it does this, okay? And then after this, things are going to twist and they're going to fold and they're going to turn and things are going to all come together and fuse in different places and it's going to turn into a heart. I'll kind of walk through some of the real basics of this as best I can, but it is kind of complicated. So here it is. It makes this S shape, and then we have this front part, we have this back part, and the different parts of this heart become different things. The Truncus Arteriosus, which was up here, this kind of looks like a tree trunk. This ends up turning into the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. Okay, so this top part becomes the aorta and pulmonary trunk, which is nice because those do actually end up staying at the top of the heart, so that's convenient. This part, so now it goes down and then it comes up again like this. So this down part down here kind of forms this little bulb. This little bulb, if you notice, is connected to the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. So what do you think it would be? What ends up pushing blood into the aorta and the pulmonary trunk? Well, the ventricles. So this little bulb here becomes the right and left ventricles. And yeah, I guess more specifically, sorry, I apologize. It becomes the outflow tracts to the right and left ventricles. I apologize. So you have the Truncus Arteriosus, which looks like a little trunk here. This is the aorta and pulmonary trunk. And then down here you have the bulbus cordis, which is connected directly to this part. That becomes the outflow tracts for the right and left ventricles. And then you see where does the blood come next? It goes up like this. So what would be right before the outflow tracts for the right and left ventricle? Obviously the right and left ventricle. So this up here, they call this the primitive ventricle. So when it folds, this is kind of the top of this little, excuse me, little outflow tract here. So this primitive ventricle part here becomes the right and left ventricles. So you can kind of see how this flow works together. So as this little thing turned into an S, primitive right and left ventricles are going to push blood into what was the bulbus cordis, which later becomes the outflow tracts, which pushes blood through the Truncus Arteriosus, which later becomes the aorta, excuse me, pulmonary trunk. Whew, allergic to something. Okay, next, down here, so it goes down, comes down. Now down at the bottom here, we have the primitive atrium. And that's convenient because those become the atrium, the right and left atrium. Because we know, remember, the atrium drain into the ventricles go into the outflow tracts for the ventricles, and then they go through the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. So, pretty straightforward if you think about it, just in relation to the heart, what it becomes, because you know the heart. And then down here at the bottom, we have this, up here with the Truncus Arteriosus, down here is the Sinus Venosus. And the Sinus Venosus, okay, you got to see here there's two. There's one here that is on the left, and there's one that's on the right, okay? Left and right. The one on the left is the Sinus Venosus on the left, and it becomes the coronary sinus. And the one on the right, the Sinus Venosus on the right, becomes the right atrium, part of the right atrium as well. So it kind of combines up into this one. So left Sinus Venosus becomes the coronary sinus. Okay? All right. And the right one becomes the right atrium. So Sinus Venosus, think of almost like these little, if you think of this like as a weird twisted tree, this would be like the roots down here, like the veins going in, and up here is the Truncus Arteriosus. Okay, so that basically covers that. I'm going to go ahead and, well, maybe I'll leave it up because it might be useful a little bit. So after this thing folds together, now this is showing here is the anterior and this is the posterior. Now kind of imagine that I'm twisting it so it's like this now. So now what you kind of see is something like this. Here would be up here the Truncus Arteriosus. Down here would be the Sinus Venosus. This would divide like that, okay? So you formed now the primitive ventricles, which used to be, or which become later, the muscular right and left ventricles. And, well, I'm not going to go ahead and worry about that too much. This thing's been cut in the middle, okay? So you're missing some structures out here because we're looking back a little bit. And then up here we have the primitive atrium. If you remember, the atrium drain into the ventricles, and the ventricles push the blood up through the aorta and pulmonary trunk. So this forms in a specific way, and it's a little complicated, but I'll try to explain as best I can. Essentially what we have going on here is up here, and we have the primitive atrium, down here we have the primitive ventricle. And in between here we have this something called the endocardial cushion. Looks like a little cushion there in the middle, and it's going to kind of divide the right atrium from, the atrium from the ventricles. But it also becomes a structure that ends up dividing the atrium from each other. So the first thing that starts to form on this is something called the septum primum. So the septum primum kind of comes down and starts to go down like this, and as it's forming, it leaves a little hole here at the bottom, so there's still a little gap there, called the Ostium Primum. Okay? Little holes formed there. And the Ostium Primum, as you can see, it kind of shrinks as the Septum Primum forms. So a septum is like something that divides here, and ostium is like a hole. So the Septum Primum comes down, and this hole gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So eventually, this little Septum Primum is going to develop some little holes in it, which is good. And that allows, this Ostium Primum is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. As blood cells go through here, so some little holes, perforations form in there. And eventually, these perforations are going to go together into one big hole as this thing, the septum, forms all the way down at the bottom. And this big hole, they have a name for it. They call this big hole the Ostium Secundum. Okay, so we have the Ostium Primum, which is the first hole, and that one closed up now. And now the one that's left over is the Ostium Secundum, like second. We had primum first, secundum second. So now this is the second hole. So Ostium Secundum. Ostium Primum is now gone. Okay. Now that we formed this thing, we start having the development of something else. With the first one, we had the Septum Primum. Now we're going to have the Septum Secundum. Okay. So remember, we have Septum Primum, Septum Secundum. Now we have Ostium, and we had Ostium Primum and Ostium Secundum. So here it is. So this Septum Secundum starts to form down like this, and over the top of it, and it goes down, and it has a little hole here in it as well, called the foramen ovale. Okay. And that stays open right up until birth, I believe. And so that's kind of how this works. Hopefully that kind of makes sense for you. First you have the Septum Primum, and then we have the Ostium Primum, which is the hole in it. And then the Ostium Primum goes away, forms the Ostium Secundum. And then the Septum Secundum started forming over the top again. And then that leaves a little hole called the foramen ovale. And if you get some septal defects with this, usually it'll be something like the associated with trisomy 21, and it'll be problems with they call them endocardial cushion defects, but it'll be like the Ostium Secundum will overlap the foramen ovale or something like that, or there'll be an absence of the Septum Secundum, or neither the Septum Secundum or the Septum Primum will develop. So that kind of explains most of that stuff. So now let's talk about the ventricles. We talked about how this thing forms together, but talking now about the primitive ventricles, what happens here is there's something called the truncoconical swellings. Okay, so on the sides here, we have, remember, there's the Truncus Arteriosus. This whole thing kind of is going to develop into, this is the aorta and pulmonary trunk, and then down here is the bulbus cordis is the outflow tracts for the ventricles, and then here we have the primitive ventricles. So what happens here essentially is down here in this primitive ventricle, I'll kind of draw it up here so you kind of see this Truncus Arteriosus has these little growths on the side, and these are swellings, and these are called the truncoconical swellings, and they swell, and then they come together and they twist. Okay, so what they're really doing is they're dividing the outflow tracts in half. If I were to take a cut of this and turn it and show it to you, it would look something like this. However, when they're first set up, before they twist, it's not a good thing because the left ventricle is pumping through the pulmonary trunk, and the right ventricle is pumping into the aorta. And so you have these two pathways that just they need to mix. You need to have the pathways switch so that one's going to the lungs, the other one's going to the heart, and then the one that's going to the heart is going back, going to the body. The one that's going from the body is then going to the lungs. You need to have this switch over so that the oxygenated blood and the deoxygenated blood can swap in their direction, not just have one continue going to the body over and over and over again, and then going to the lungs over and over again. So this switch happens here where it kind of twists, and as it twists, it kind of it's going to kind of like twist 180 degrees so that it kind of changes the direction of these outflow tracts, so it'll look different, and it'll have a different course of action, a course of blood flow, like this, so that this blood will go that way, and this blood will go that way, and you'll have blood going where it needs to go, okay? So that the left ventricle will go into the aorta, and the right ventricle will go into the pulmonary trunk. And so yeah, that's that 180 twist. If this don't twist, they call that the transposition of the great vessels. Sometimes you can also have a patent Truncus Arteriosus, where essentially, normally you have a heart that is going to look something like this. It actually doesn't look like this, but mechanically it works like this, where you have the right ventricle and the left ventricle, and they're going to go on and they're going to separate, push out blood different places. But in a patent Truncus Arteriosus, they both go together, mixing oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood into one cord, and then after mix, then it goes off. So people present with sinus and that sort of thing like that. And then also you have tetralogy of Fetal, which is a combination of several things, septal defects, and you watched another video on that one. All right, and I guess that's probably one last thing I guess I'll mention in this video is about the aortic arches. So for this, I'm going to, I guess, just erase what I have here so you can see how this works. If you remember, I guess probably, I don't know, look it up. You can find what the aortic arches are. I won't go into detail about that, but I'm just going to explain here really briefly. You need to remember what these are. So you have these different arches, okay? And the first arch that comes off is going to end up going up into, I'll just draw it out here. Here's the jaw, so the maxillary. First arch is going to go up and be the maxillary artery. So 1 equals maxillary. That's a person. See? That's there, yeah. And then the next one is that's going to branch off. Number 2 is going to go up into, it's going to kind of do two things. So for one, we have the hyoid bone here, and we also have up here in the ear, the stapedius. So number 2 kind of branches off and supplies both the hyoid and also the stapedial artery. So that's what number 2 does. And then number 3, the third arch, is going to go into the common carotid and also a little bit of the proximal part of, I think it's the internal carotid. So if you remember, you've got your arch of the aorta, and then you have the 3 big vessels coming off of there. These ones on the inside are going to end up going up like this, and they're going to be the common carotid, and they're going to branch into the common carotid and the external carotid and the internal carotid. And so this one here is going to be that common carotid. I should have drawn this on the bottom and this on the top. Sorry, I ran out of room. Next, the fourth one here, fourth aortic arch, is actually going to be the arch of the aorta. So this part here, the fourth one, is actually going to develop into, coming off the heart, here's the heart, there's the arch of the aorta. So 4 is arch of aorta. There it is, number 4. Number 3 is the common carotid there. And then number 6, yes, I know it skips 5, we'll look into that later. This one's going to become the ductus arteriosus and the pulmonary artery. So 6 is just prior to the arch of the aorta. Remember, before it goes in there, it goes its different ways. So this is going to be the ductus arteriosus. and the pulmonary. And that's all for this video.